This lecture is about the origins of Zoroastrianism. Indo-European people from the steppes region north of the Caspian and Black Seas around 1200 BCE were on the move everywhere, going north, west, east, and south. And one of these groups we call Iranians or Iranic people, and they moved into the region that is, roughly equivalent to modern-day Iran. And this group included two of history's most important subpopulations, the Medes and the Persians. And again, just part of a vast movement of Indo-European people everywhere. Originally, they were nomadic. They were nomads and horse breeders, and the fact that they could ride horses and they had chariots gave them a distinct advantage over the natives when they move into the region, and different groups of Iranians created a patchwork of small kingdoms. Now, Iranian religion was originally simple. They had a chief god, Ahura Mazda, who was the creator of all things, and really the benefactor of all living creatures. But he was not a lone god. These early Iranians were polytheistic. This important Iranian god was called Mithra. He was a sun god who saw to justice and redemption. Other deities personified natural elements like the moon, the earth, water, wind. The god of fire was especially important because fire consumed the blood sacrifices that the early Iranians offered to their deities. And they had a priestly class to do this, a magi, who ran the fire temples where the sacrifices were received. Now, sometimes through human history, religions can become sterile. They lose their meaning as time goes by, and people forget what their rituals were for. And these religions can become emotionally unsatisfying. And I've made this point before. Religions that become sterile, that don't appeal to people's emotions, tend to be the religions that don't last long, unless someone comes along to change it. Now, as for these early Iranians, around the year 600 BCE, a prophet named Zoroaster, or Zarathustra, both are spelled for you there, breathed new meaning into this religion. Zoroaster will often be called the world's first philosopher. His birth date, we think, is around 660 BCE. We get information about him from the Zend-Avesta. The Zend-Avesta is a collection of sacred hymns and poems that we think weren't really written down until about the 3rd century BCE, so 200 or 300 years after Zoroaster's life. Now, his doctrine was completely new. He introduced completely new concepts. And the central idea was that life is a constant battle between good and evil. Ahura Mazda was the god of good and truth. And at this point, this religion became monotheistic, that Ahura Mazda was the only god that exists. And he's pictured there in the middle. But other gods continued to hang around, but in different forms. So someone like Mithra, for example, would become a Yazada, which is like an angelic divinity. Or gods might become devas, helpful to humankind. So, with only one real god, Ahura Mazda, he's in competition with someone, right? If life is a battle between good and evil, well, what is evil? Evil is Ahriman, sort of a force of evil and falsehood. Don't think of Ahriman like a god. Right? Similar to Christianity, Satan isn't considered a god. The devil isn't considered a god. He's an evil force. And Zoroaster described this as a destructive spirit or mentality that lives inside people or can enter inside someone's mind or someone's emotions. And this belief was that Ahura Mazda and Ahriman were locked in a constant battle for the human race, a battle that stretched over thousands of years. But people were not pawns. They have free will to choose sides. It's the individual's responsibility to decide what side they want to be on. A person was to rely on their own conscience, because one day there would be a time of reckoning. Ahura Mazda would win. He would triumph. And then each person would be judged on their deeds. If they were judged to have been a good person, they would go to this wonderful paradise. Sometimes it was called the abode of good thought. Sometimes it was called the house of song. But it's just this beautiful place that would await people who lived their lives according to good and truth. Someone who was a liar, who was wicked, well, they would be condemned to eternal pain and darkness. So this is a kind of last judgment. And these concepts of good and evil in a battle and a last judgment at the end of time, none of these ideas ever existed before. Well, they exist now, though, don't they? All of these things probably sound very familiar to you. Now, at first, Zoroastrianism, these ideas met resistance. New ideas always do. But his thought converted the Persian king Darius I. He lived around 521 to 486 BCE. And when King Darius I became a Zoroastrian, the whole Persian royal family adopted it. Now, Darius did not impose Zoroastrianism on the Persian people, but normally when the elite of a society convert to a new faith, the rest of the population just follows suit. And eventually Zoroastrianism becomes the religion of the Persian Empire. It spread throughout Iran and even survived the eventual fall of the Persian Empire. Zoroastrianism exists today. There are still a handful of people in the Near East who follow this faith. And as you can see, it definitely had an influence on Christianity and also on Greek philosophy. So thank you, Zoroaster.